Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to this explainer. I want you to imagine, just for a second, the very first time in human history that someone encountered a lifeless body. That singular, completely shocking moment birthed humanity's darkest and absolutely most profound fear, the terror of nothingness. Today, we're going to explore how our greatest social structures, our belief systems, and literally the foundations of our civilizations were built purely to escape that overwhelming terror. Just picture it. You're shaking your companion, and there's just no response. The body is cold, they aren't breathing. It's a raw, primal shock. Our early ancestors couldn't process this profound absurdity, right? So they didn't just casually philosophize about death. They lived in constant, terrifying proximity to it. And to cope with the absolute dread of just disappearing, they crafted some of the most bizarre, terrifying, and elaborate defense mechanisms on Earth. Section 1. The Primal Shock and the Myth of Flowers. To understand exactly how this shaped human behavior, we have to travel back roughly 100,000 years to the freezing, isolated Shanidar cave. And there is a really stark contrast we need to talk about here. When archaeologists first found pollen from yarrow and hyacinth around a Neanderthal skeleton, almost everyone jumped on this beautifully romantic myth. They thought, oh, how sweet, they left flowers out of love and grief. But the dark reality? This was a frantic survival tactic. A decomposing body's scent would attract massive cave bears and dire wolves right to the tribe. So hiding the flesh under soil and fragrant plants wasn't a romantic gesture at all. It was a desperate cover-up to keep the living from being eaten. And here is where things get really fascinating. This sheer survival instinct warped their primitive psychology. Burying bodies actually evolved from a purely practical need to hide a scent into this deep-seated belief that death was a contagious supernatural disease. They essentially believed that if the body wasn't hidden, the dark spirit of death would just sweep through and claim the rest of the tribe. That primal collective terror really set the stage for all the complex rituals we're going to see next. Section 2. Monetizing the afterlife, the Egyptian death trade. Let's fast forward a bit and move from those cold caves to the blistering sands of ancient Egypt, where the fear of the afterlife was transformed into a highly profitable empire. This brilliantly illustrates how institutional fear works and how religious institutions started profiting from it. Just look at the afterlife threats they were facing. You have the perilous realm of the Duat, literally crawling with monsters. The solution? Well, priests happily sold you a cheat code, the Papyrus of Ani, or Book of the Dead, for astronomical prices. Worried the terrifying monster Ammit would eat your sinful heart during cosmic judgment? No problem. You could just buy a gold scarab spell to command your own heart not to snitch on you. Even eternal labor for the gods could be entirely bypassed if you were wealthy enough to buy Ushapti figures to do the heavy lifting. Religion here essentially became a transactional business model to manage mass existential dread. Section 3. The Bloody Send-Off. Vikings and the Angel of Death. Let's shift gears from Egyptian bureaucracy to the freezing north, where we see a stark contrast with the visceral, violent defense mechanisms of the Vikings. We have this absolutely chilling historical account from 922 AD by an ambassador named Ibn Fadlan. When a chieftain died, the community threw a massive 10-day alcohol binge. During this, a slave girl would be heavily psychologically pressured to volunteer to accompany him. On the final day, a terrifying woman known as the Angel of Death performed a gruesome sacrifice inside a pavilion on a boat. But pay attention to this wild detail. The men outside were banging their shields with their swords. Why? It was a psychological tool. They had to drown out her screams so the village wouldn't hear her terror. They needed to maintain the social illusion that this bloody send-off was a glorious departure rather than a horrific murder. Part 4. Philosophical Extremes, the body as trash versus terror. Moving right along, let's see how geography shaped incredibly different psychological defense mechanisms in Tibet and ancient Persia. This is such a fascinating comparative analysis. We're looking at two ancient cultures dealing with the exact same existential dread, but they created polar opposite solutions. Tibetans trained themselves to see the dead body as just an empty, meaningless shell, but ancient Zoroastrian Persians, they viewed it as the ultimate source of demonic pollution. High up in the Rocky Mountains of Tibet, where wood for cremation is really scarce, they perform the sky burial. The body breaker, known as the Ragyapan, slices the body up specifically to feed to massive vultures. They even crush the bones, so absolutely nothing is left behind. Now, to modernize, this might look horrifying, but for them, it's the ultimate act of psychological detachment and giving back to nature. Monks even craft flutes from the leftover femur bones to play during rituals. It's a constant, physical reminder of life's impermanence. Meanwhile, over in ancient Persia, their fear manifested as a terrifying entity called Nasu. They believed that the second a person died, this corpse demon instantly possessed the flesh. Because of this profound fear of contagious evil, they couldn't bury the dead, they couldn't burn them, and they couldn't drown them, because that would pollute the sacred elements of earth, fire, and water. This extreme terror literally dictated their architecture, leading to the creation of the Towers of Silence, isolated mountain structures where bodies were left to the elements, completely walled off from the living world. And the lengths they went to just to feel safe are incredible. Before even moving a body, they performed the Sagdit ritual. They would bring a dog, specifically one with 2 spots above its eyes, making it 4-eyed, to stare directly at the corpse. They genuinely believed the dog's gaze would temporarily blind the demon, allowing humans to safely transport the body. It's a perfect example of how societies invent very specific religious tools to calm collective paralyzing fear. Section 5. The Mayan Blood Debt. Death as Social Control. Let's travel across the ocean now to the Mayan civilization to uncover how death was weaponized to control the masses. The Mayans brilliantly and frankly brutally engineered their society through the fear of death. They believed the universe literally ran on a blood debt. Innocent victims, painted in sacred blue, were hurled alive into terrifying sinkholes called cenotes just to appease the gods. But the true dark genius was how the ruling class manipulated the whole concept of the afterlife for social control. They made dying peacefully in bed sound absolutely miserable, a one-way ticket to a dark, endless void. Would dying be a violent sacrifice? Boom, VIP pass straight to a lush paradise. It was a massive psychological operation to make people literally volunteer for death. Part 6. The Physical Terror. Ancient Zombies. We're going to bring this explainer back to the cradle of Western civilization now, because beneath all the high philosophy of ancient Greece and Rome lay a raw physical panic. Meet the Vrikolakas. This perfectly validates that the concept of the undead isn't just some modern Hollywood invention. It was a genuine, intense historical anxiety. Despite having such an advanced society, ancient Greeks were deeply, legitimately terrified that the people they buried might physically rise from the grave. This links our physical burial traditions directly to an absolute terror of the walking dead. And the proof is in the dirt. Archaeologists digging in ancient Greek colonies in Sicily found some incredibly gruesome defense mechanisms. They unearthed skeletons pinned down with heavy stones over their heads, or deliberately buried face down, so if they woke up and tried to dig out, they just dig deeper into the earth. Some were literally nailed down. Why all this hysteria? Because before modern medicine, horrific mistakes happened. People in comas or suffering from catalepsy were buried alive. When graves were later opened and scratch marks were found on the inside of coffins, it fueled an absolute panic about a zombie invasion. Section 7. The Modern Mirror. Running from Nothingness. Okay, let's pull all these narrative threads together. As much as we might look back and judge these ancient bloody rituals, we really need to take a hard look in the modern mirror. This is a deeply sobering conclusion. When you step back and look at the subconscious impact of our mortality, a profound truth emerges. Every pyramid, every complex religious system, every bizarre physical burial rite, and honestly every modern distraction we have is just a psychological shield. Deep down, our brains still cannot comprehend the concept of nothingness. Our modern suits, our status symbols, our endlessly scrolling phones, they're all just our contemporary versions of throwing flowers over a lifeless body so we can hide from the void. And that brings us to the ultimate question. If all human civilization is just a grand defense mechanism to distract us from the terror of nothingness, what are you using to distract yourself today? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. If you want to keep exploring the fascinating shadows of our history, make sure to subscribe. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you next time.